Zane liked problems that behaved logically. Code either compiled or it didn't. Servers either responded or crashed. Algorithms either produced elegant solutions or embarrassing error messages that made programmers question their life choices. Real life, unfortunately, had no debug mode. The evening had started normally enough. Zane sat at his workstation, surrounded by glowing monitors that painted his small apartment in layers of pale blue light. A rainstorm drifted across the city outside, tapping softly against the window. The sound blended with the quiet hum of cooling fans and processors working through several thousand lines of code that absolutely refused to cooperate. "Come on," Zane muttered to the screen. "You worked yesterday." The program disagreed. A bright red error message appeared. Zane leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "Fantastic," he sighed. "Betrayed by my own creation. Classic programmer tragedy." His apartment reflected his lifestyle perfectly. Every surface held some piece of technology. Half-built drones rested beside tangled charging cables. A smart coffee machine sat on the counter, silently judging him for drinking too much caffeine. 3 different processors blinked with diagnostic lights like tiny alien cities. Ironically, aliens had officially joined human society 5 years ago. Interstellar contact had been confirmed, trade routes established, and several species had opened diplomatic offices on Earth. Zane had watched the news coverage like everyone else, fascinated for about 2 days before returning to his code. Aliens were interesting, sure, but they rarely knocked on his door. The knock that came now was not polite. It sounded more like someone trying to punch their way through the door. Zane blinked. He checked the time. 9:42 p.m. Most of his neighbors avoided knocking on his door after the incident, with the experimental drone vacuum that had chased someone down the hallway. Long story, slightly embarrassing. The knocking came again, harder. Okay, Zane called. "Relax. The door is not a hostile alien invasion." He stood, stretched his stiff back, and walked across the apartment. As he reached the door, he glanced automatically at the security display mounted beside it. The hallway camera showed a woman standing outside. She looked strange, not dangerous, just strange. Her hair was dark and tangled slightly, as if she had been running. Her expression carried a sharp mixture of urgency and exhaustion. Even through the grainy hallway camera, Zane could see intelligence in her eyes, alert, calculating. Then he noticed her ears. They were long, not dramatically so, but long enough to sweep slightly back through her hair, with a subtle elegance that immediately made it clear she was not human. Zane stared at the screen. "Well," he murmured, "that's new." The knocking came again. Zane opened the door. The woman nearly stumbled forward the moment it slid open. She caught herself on the doorframe, breathing hard, her eyes scanning the hallway behind her. Up close, she looked even more unusual. Her face had the delicate symmetry common among several known alien species, but her skin tone and features were close enough to human that the difference felt almost surreal. Those long ears tilted slightly as she looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said very clearly, "Hide me, human." Zane blinked twice. "Hello to you too," he said. Her eyes flicked down the hallway again. "Please," she said quickly. "They are coming." "Who is—" Distant sirens howled somewhere beyond the building. Zane paused. The woman looked directly at him now, and for the first time he saw something beneath the urgency. Fear. Real fear. Zane's brain began processing several possibilities. Option 1, elaborate scam. Option 2, strange role-playing neighbor. Option 3, the beginning of a very bad evening. Another siren echoed closer. The woman stepped half a pace toward him. "I will explain," she said quickly, "but if you do not hide me now, explanation will become unnecessary." Zane looked at her long ears again. Then he sighed. "Fine," he said. "But if this turns out to be a prank show, I want royalties." She clearly had no idea what that meant. He stepped aside. "Inside," he said. She rushed past him into the apartment. Zane closed the door behind her just as the distant sound of heavy engines rolled into the street outside. He walked toward the window. Military vehicles were pulling up along the curb. Zane stared down at them. Then he slowly turned back toward the strange woman now standing in the middle of his living room, trying to calm her breathing. "Well," he said thoughtfully, This is already the most exciting thing that has happened in my apartment since my toaster tried to install an operating system. Zane stood by the window for a moment longer than necessary, watching the convoy of military vehicles settle into place below his building. The streetlights reflected off their armored surfaces like cold stars. One of the transports released a small surveillance drone that lifted silently into the air and began scanning the surrounding buildings. Zane slowly turned away from the window. "Well," he said calmly. "Good news." The woman looked at him, her long ears angled slightly forward. "What good news?" "They did not bring tanks." She blinked at him. "That is good?" "Oh, absolutely," Zane replied. "Tanks would mean they were very serious. Right now they are only moderately serious." She stared at him as if she had accidentally entered the home of a very strange human. Zane gestured vaguely around the apartment. "Welcome to my home," he added. "Please ignore the cables. If you trip on one of them, the internet might collapse." The woman took a cautious step forward, examining the room. Her eyes moved with sharp precision, scanning the monitors, the processors, the stacked data drives, and a small drone sitting disassembled on the coffee table. "You build machines," she said quietly. "I fix them," Zane corrected. "Or at least I try to. Sometimes they win." Outside, the low hum of engines vibrated faintly through the building walls. The woman flinched. Zane noticed. "Okay," he said, raising a hand slightly. "Step 1. You look like someone being chased by several extremely unpleasant people. Step 2. Those extremely unpleasant people are now outside my apartment building. Step 3. I feel like step 4 should involve an explanation." She hesitated. Zane tilted his head. "Preferably before they start knocking on doors." The woman moved closer to the window, but stayed just far enough away to avoid being seen. "They are soldiers," she said. "Yes," Zane replied. "That part I noticed. The armored trucks were a strong clue. They are searching for me." "Also noticed that." Another drone passed outside the window, scanning the upper floors of the building with a narrow beam of blue light. Zane casually reached over and pulled the blinds shut. "Privacy is underrated," he said. The woman looked at him again. "You are not afraid." "Oh, I am absolutely afraid," Zane replied. "I am just delaying the panic until I have more information." She seemed to consider that answer. "What is your name?" she asked. "Zane." She nodded slightly. "My name is Kessa." Zane repeated it once under his breath, as if storing it in memory. "Well, Kessa," he said, "normally when people visit my apartment unexpectedly, they are trying to sell me something or complain about my drones." Her long ears tilted slightly. "You have drones?" "Yes. They occasionally misbehave. Last week, one of them attempted to deliver pizza to the wrong apartment and declared independence." Kessa stared at him. "You are joking." "Mostly." The sound of boots echoed faintly from the building's lower hallway. Kessa stiffened instantly. "They are entering the building." Zane exhaled slowly. "Of course they are." He walked to his desk and tapped several commands into one of the consoles. "What are you doing?" Kessa asked quietly. "Two things," Zane replied. "First, locking my internal network so none of their scanners connect to my systems." He typed another command. "And second," several small lights around the apartment dimmed as his internal security system activated. "Giving my apartment a personality disorder." Kessa frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "My devices are about to start broadcasting dozens of harmless signals," Zane explained. "Smart refrigerator updates, music downloads, weather reports, useless smart home chatter." He leaned back slightly. "Military scanners hate messy data environments." The boots in the hallway were getting closer now. Kessa looked at the apartment door as if it might explode. Zane noticed the tension in her shoulders. "You know," he said casually, "I had planned to spend tonight arguing with my code and eating instant noodles." Kessa looked at him. "This is worse?" "Oh, definitely," Zane said, "but it's also more interesting." Then the knock came. 3 heavy strikes against the door. Kessa froze. Zane stood up slowly and stretched his shoulders. "Well," he said quietly, "this is the part where I pretend to be a completely boring citizen." He glanced toward the hallway closet. "Quick," he whispered. Kessa looked at the closet, then at him. "You want me to hide in there?" "Yes. There are vacuum devices inside." They are harmless, Zane said. Emotionally unstable, but harmless. Another knock, louder. Zane opened the closet door. Go. Kessa slipped inside between jackets and equipment, folding herself silently into the narrow space. Her long ears barely avoided brushing the doorframe. Zane closed the closet gently. Then he walked to the apartment door and opened it. 3 soldiers stood outside. Their armor carried the insignia of the Planetary Security Forces. One of them held a tablet displaying an image. Good evening, the officer said flatly. We are conducting a search. Zane leaned casually against the doorframe. Is this about the parking violation? He asked. Because technically, that drone parked itself. The officer ignored the comment and turned the tablet toward him. The screen displayed a photo. Kessa. Have you seen this individual? The officer asked. Zane looked at the image. Then he scratched his chin thoughtfully. He said. Behind him, inside the closet, something shifted very slightly. Zane coughed loudly. Then he looked back at the officer. Nope, he said. Just me and my extremely disappointing cooking skills in here. The officer did not laugh. Zane had not expected him to, but it would have been nice. The soldier studied Zane with the kind of expression that suggested he had encountered many strange civilians before and had stopped being surprised by any of them. Behind him, 2 other soldiers stood in the hallway like extremely serious furniture. We have reason to believe the individual entered this building, the officer said. Zane nodded slowly. That makes sense, he replied. Buildings are very popular places for entering. The officer blinked once. Behind Zane, inside the apartment, one of the processors hummed louder as it spun up another layer of encrypted traffic. The officer glanced past Zane's shoulder, scanning the interior of the apartment. His gaze moved across the monitors, the cables, the scattered tools, the half-assembled drone on the table, and the glowing data rack stacked against the wall. You work with machines, the officer observed. I try, Zane said. They have strong opinions about that. Another soldier stepped forward slightly. What exactly do you do here? Zane shrugged. I write software. Sometimes I repair damaged systems. Occasionally I accidentally break them again. The officer held up the tablet again, the image of Kessa glowing on the screen. She is considered dangerous. Zane leaned closer to the image, squinting slightly. Dangerous how? He asked. That information is classified. Well, that's inconvenient, Zane replied, because if she were dangerous, I would definitely want to know before inviting her in for tea. The soldiers did not react. Zane folded his arms. Inside the closet, Kessa had not moved. Zane could almost feel the tension radiating from the door behind him. The officer stepped forward half a pace. We need to scan the apartment. Zane's brain immediately began calculating probabilities. Probability of successful hiding. Moderate. Probability of the soldiers noticing the closet. High. Probability of his smart refrigerator trying to greet them out loud. Unfortunately, very high. Zane sighed. Of course, he said, stepping aside. Feel free. Just don't touch the blue cable near the floor. The officer paused. What happens if we touch it? Zane thought for a moment. Honestly, he said, I'm not entirely sure anymore. The soldier stepped into the apartment. Kessa heard their boots immediately. Inside the narrow closet space, she stood perfectly still, listening to the sounds of movement outside. Her species had evolved excellent hearing, and right now every footstep sounded like thunder. The soldiers were spreading through the apartment. One approached the window, another inspected the workstation, the third moved slowly toward the kitchen. Zane watched them while leaning against the wall, trying to appear like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. The soldier at the workstation frowned at the screens. What is this program running? Zane glanced over. Oh, that? He said casually. That's a simulation. Of what? Failure. The soldier looked at him. Zane smiled faintly. My code is very educational. Meanwhile, the soldier in the kitchen opened the refrigerator. The smart appliance woke up immediately. Hello, Zane, it said cheerfully. Your weekly vegetable intake remains critically low. The soldier froze. Zane winced. Sorry, he said. It judges me. The soldier slowly closed the refrigerator door. Across the room, the officer was now approaching the hallway that led toward the closet. Zane's pulse jumped slightly. The officer examined the hallway walls, the storage cabinet, and finally the closet door. His hand moved toward the handle. Inside the closet, Kessa closed her eyes briefly. Zane spoke quickly. "Careful with that one." The officer paused. "Why?" Zane hesitated just long enough to make the answer believable. "Experimental equipment," he said. The officer looked at the door again. "What kind of equipment?" Zane scratched the back of his head. "Autonomous cleaning prototypes." The officer frowned. "Cleaning devices?" "Yes," Zane said. "They are extremely aggressive." For a moment, the officer simply stared at him. "Open the door," the officer said. Zane exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "this is going to be awkward." He stepped forward and reached for the handle. Inside the closet, Kessa shifted slightly, preparing for the worst. Zane opened the door. A small, spherical robot rolled forward immediately and bumped into the officer's boot. The machine chirped loudly. "Target acquired." Then it began aggressively vacuuming the officer's shoe. The officer stepped back sharply. "What is this?" Zane grabbed the device quickly and lifted it off the floor. "Prototype," he said apologetically. "Very enthusiastic." The soldier near the kitchen coughed, clearly trying not to laugh. The officer looked inside the closet. Jackets, boxes, cleaning equipment. No alien woman. After a long moment, he stepped back. "You should control your machines," he said. Zane nodded. "I keep telling them that." The soldiers finished their search quickly after that. Within minutes, they returned to the hallway. The officer gave Zane one last long look. "If you see the individual from the image," he said, "report it immediately." "Absolutely," Zane said. The soldiers left. Their boots faded down the hallway. The elevator doors closed. The building fell quiet again. Zane stood still for several seconds. Then he walked to the closet and opened the door again. Kessa stepped out slowly, her eyes wide. She looked at the little vacuum robot still clutched in Zane's hand. "That machine saved my life," she said. Zane looked down at it. "Yeah," he said thoughtfully. "First time it has done anything useful." Zane stood by the door for a long moment after the soldiers left, listening carefully to the fading echo of their boots in the hallway. He had developed a programmer's habit of waiting a few seconds before declaring anything finished. Programs that seemed stable had a tendency to collapse the moment you trusted them. Finally, he exhaled. "Okay," he said quietly. "That was unpleasant." Behind him, Kessa stepped fully out of the closet. Her long ears were slightly tilted backward, the way they seemed to move whenever she was thinking quickly. "You lied to armed soldiers without hesitation," she said. Zane shrugged. "I hesitate internally," he replied. "Externally, I just improvise." Kessa studied him for a moment. Her eyes moved across the apartment again, but this time she was not scanning for exits. She seemed to be observing Zane himself. "You are either very brave," she said slowly, "or very foolish." Zane walked back toward his desk and dropped into his chair. "Oh, I am definitely foolish," he said. "Bravery is still under review." Kessa glanced toward the window. The street outside had grown quieter, but several armored vehicles still waited below like patient predators. "They will return," she said. "Probably," Zane replied. He began typing quickly on one of his consoles. Several windows filled the monitors with streaming code and diagnostic graphs. Kessa stepped closer. "What are you doing now?" "Cleaning up our digital mess," Zane said. "When the military scans buildings, they also monitor network activity. If your devices or implants transmitted anything unusual, it might appear in their logs." She frowned slightly. "You believe they track signals that precisely?" Zane looked up at her. "They are the military." She considered that for a moment. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "That is fair." Zane continued typing. Lines of code flowed down the screen like falling rain. "What exactly are you?" he asked suddenly. Kessa blinked. "I am a scientist." "I meant biologically," Zane clarified. "Your species." Her long ears shifted slightly again. "My people are called the Valiran." Zane nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "That sounds impressive. I was worried you might say something impossible to pronounce." "It is actually much longer in our language," she replied calmly. "Of course it is." Another program finished compiling. Zane leaned back and cracked his knuckles. Network traffic masked, Signal noise generated. Satellite routing rerouted. Kessa looked confused. What does that mean? It means, Zane said, that if someone tries to track communications from this apartment, they will find 3,000 automated weather reports, 200 cooking tutorials, and a documentary about emotionally sensitive dolphins. She stared at him. Why dolphins? Because no intelligence analyst will ever suspect the dolphins. Kessa's expression softened slightly. You are joking again. Humor, Zane said, is an essential survival tool. For a moment, silence filled the apartment. Kessa finally sat down across from him. Her posture relaxed slightly, though tension still lingered in her eyes. You have not asked the most important question, she said. Zane glanced at her. Which one? Why they are hunting me. Zane thought about that. Then he reached over and grabbed a cup from the desk. It contained what used to be coffee, but now resembled a small geological formation. He sniffed it. Still technically coffee, he said. He set it aside. All right, he said, folding his arms. Let's hear it. Kessa hesitated. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the window again before returning to him. I worked for the Valerian Military Research Division, she said. Zane nodded. Already sounds dangerous. My team studied atmospheric dispersal technology. Zane leaned forward slightly. That also sounds dangerous. It was originally designed to neutralize biological hazards, she continued. If a plague appeared on a colony world, our systems could release targeted compounds that would destroy the pathogen without harming the population. Zane's eyebrows rose. That actually sounds useful. Kessa's voice lowered. It was. Zane waited. She continued. But the program was changed. The room seemed to grow slightly quieter. Zane tilted his head. Changed how? Her fingers tightened slightly. They rewrote the algorithms, she said. Instead of eliminating pathogens, the dispersal system could target specific genetic markers. Zane stared at her. You mean, yes, she said, species-level targeting. Zane leaned back slowly in his chair. Well, he muttered, that escalated quickly. Kessa's eyes darkened slightly. It was meant to wipe out entire populations. Zane rubbed his face with both hands. Okay, he said after a moment. That is significantly worse than my toaster installing an operating system. She looked at him, clearly unsure whether that was humor or confusion. I discovered the change by accident, she continued quietly. Someone had hidden the modifications inside encrypted research files. Zane's attention sharpened. You copied them? Yes. And now the military wants them back. They want me silenced. Zane leaned forward again, elbows on the desk. For several seconds he studied her face. Her fear earlier had not been panic. It had been certainty. Then he sighed. Well, he said, that explains the soldiers. Kessa looked at him carefully. You still have not asked the second important question. What question is that? She met his eyes. Why I chose your door. Zane considered that. Then he shrugged. Honestly, he said, I assumed it was because my hallway lighting is slightly brighter. Kessa blinked. That is your theory? Either that, Zane said, or destiny. She stared at him. Zane smiled faintly. I'm hoping for the lighting explanation, he added. It feels safer. Zane leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, processing what Kessa had just told him. His brain, which normally specialized in logical structures and elegant code, was now attempting to digest the idea that someone had redesigned a scientific tool into a weapon capable of erasing entire species. Okay, he said finally, lowering his feet back to the floor. That's impressively terrible. Kessa sat across from him, watching his reaction carefully. You understand the danger now, she said quietly. Oh, I understood the danger the moment soldiers knocked on my door, Zane replied. But this adds a new level of unpleasantness. He spun his chair slowly and looked at the screens. So let me summarize, he continued. You discovered your research was turned into a genocide machine. You copied the evidence, and now a very angry military wants to retrieve both you and the data. Yes, Zane rubbed his temples. And somehow this situation has relocated itself to my living room. Kessa tilted her head slightly. You could still report me. Zane looked at her. You mean call the soldiers back and say, hello again? I found your dangerous alien scientist hiding between my jackets? Yes. Zane thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. No, he said. Kessa blinked. That was a very fast decision. Well, Zane said, gesturing toward his computer screens. First of all, if what you're saying is true, then turning you in would be helping people commit mass murder. That seems like bad karma. She watched him carefully. And second, Zane shrugged. They already searched my apartment once. If I suddenly report you now, they will definitely suspect I lied earlier. Kessa considered that logic. That is surprisingly practical. Thank you, Zane said. I try to maintain a consistent level of cowardice. She almost smiled. Outside, the low rumble of engines echoed again as one of the armored vehicles repositioned in the street below. Kessa's attention instantly shifted toward the window. They are still here. Yeah, Zane said. Military types are very persistent. He turned back to his console. All right, next problem. Kessa leaned forward slightly. What problem? The evidence you stole, Zane said. Where is it? She tapped the small metallic device attached to the side of her wrist. Zane leaned closer. That's it. It is encrypted, she replied. I assumed that. Zane studied the device. How big is the dataset? Approximately 12 petabytes. Zane froze. 12... what? Petabytes? He stared at her. That is not evidence, he said slowly. That is an entire internet. It includes research logs, military communications, predictive models, and deployment simulations. Zane leaned back again. You stole their entire project. Yes. Bold strategy. She watched him with quiet seriousness. If the data is released publicly, the program cannot continue. Zane scratched his chin. Well, he said, technically that is true. You disagree? Oh no, Zane replied. I just want to point out that uploading 12 petabytes of stolen military data from my apartment might attract attention. She frowned slightly. I had not fully considered the bandwidth limitations. Zane gestured proudly at his monitors. Welcome to the world of civilian internet infrastructure. For a moment, they both sat silently. Then Zane's fingers began moving across the keyboard again. What are you doing? Kessa asked. Thinking, he replied. Lines of code began appearing across the screens again. You cannot upload everything directly, he continued. But we do not need to. Kessa watched the flowing code. Explain. We fragment the data. He opened several network maps. Instead of sending the entire dataset from one source, we scatter encrypted fragments across thousands of relays. She leaned closer. Like hiding pieces of a puzzle. Exactly. Zane smiled slightly. And once the fragments are everywhere, we release the decryption key publicly. Kessa's eyes widened slightly. That would make the evidence impossible to erase. Correct. She studied him. You came up with that very quickly. Zane shrugged. I spend a lot of time thinking about how information moves. He pointed at the screen. Step 1. Disguise the fragments as harmless traffic, such as streaming media, software updates, academic data, boring government reports. He paused. And cat videos. Kessa sighed softly. You are obsessed with these animals. They are the backbone of human internet culture. Another drone passed outside the building window, its scanning beams sweeping across nearby rooftops. Kessa lowered her voice. How long will this process take? Zane glanced at the code compiling. Uploading everything. Maybe 12 hours. Her ears tilted slightly. 12 hours? Give or take. That is too long. Zane nodded. Yes, he said calmly. It is. They both fell silent. Then Kessa spoke again. If they discover I am here before the upload finishes, then things get very unpleasant, Zane finished. She nodded. Zane leaned back again and stretched his arms. Well, he said casually, good thing we already established that tonight is unpleasant. Kessa stared at him. You are remarkably calm for someone hiding a fugitive scientist and sabotaging a military conspiracy. Zane thought about that. Then he gestured toward his computer. Honestly, he said, this is still easier than debugging my code from yesterday. Kessa looked at the screens again. What was wrong with your code? Zane sighed deeply. A missing semicolon. She blinked. That sounds trivial. Zane shook his head. You have no idea. The apartment slowly transformed into something very different from the quiet programmer's cave it had been only a few hours earlier. Screens glowed brighter, processors hummed louder, and cables that had once looked like chaotic clutter suddenly served very deliberate purposes. Zane moved through the room with a focus that surprised even himself. On the main monitor, dozens of network routes spread across the screen like glowing constellations. Each one represented a relay node, a satellite bounce, or a disguised packet stream traveling through civilian infrastructure. Kessa stood behind him, watching the growing web of connections. You are turning your home into a communications hub, she said. Zane nodded without looking away from the code. Technically illegal in several countries, he said, but tonight feels like a good night to explore new hobbies. Another progress bar appeared on the screen. Kessa studied it. What does that mean? That, Zane said, means your 12 petabytes of extremely inconvenient truth have begun traveling across the internet. She leaned closer. The numbers moved slowly but steadily upward. Upload fragment 1%. Kessa exhaled quietly. It has begun. Yep. Zane leaned back slightly and stretched his shoulders. Now we just need the entire planetary network to behave perfectly for the next 12 hours. She glanced at him. Does that happen often? Zane laughed softly. Not even once in recorded history. Kessa folded her arms and looked at the surrounding machines. I must admit, she said, I did not expect the fate of my evidence to depend on a human apartment filled with consumer electronics. Zane gestured proudly around the room. This is not consumer electronics. He pointed to a stack of processors humming under the desk. That cluster is a distributed encryption engine. Then he pointed to a small cube-shaped device blinking near the wall. That one manages satellite rerouting. Finally, he pointed toward the kitchen counter. And that one is my smart toaster. Kessa looked at the toaster. What does it do? Mostly burns things, Zane said. She shook her head slightly. You are a very unusual human. Thank you, he replied. Outside the window, another drone passed through the night sky. Its scanning beam briefly swept across the building before moving on. Kessa's attention followed it. They are still searching. Zane glanced toward the window, but did not seem overly concerned. They are probably checking every building in the district, he said, which means statistically, they will be wrong most of the time. That is not reassuring. It is if you understand probability. The progress bar climbed to 3%. Kessa sat down slowly on the couch, still watching the screen. You are risking your life for someone you met less than an hour ago. Zane shrugged. Technically 2 hours now. That does not change my point. Zane spun his chair slightly so he could see her. You knocked on my door and looked like the universe had just collapsed behind you, he said simply. She did not reply. And, he added, anyone being chased by armored vehicles probably deserves at least one ally. Kessa looked down at her wrist device. My people believe this research would protect lives. Zane nodded. That's how most bad weapons start. She glanced up. You speak from experience? From history, Zane replied. Humans have an impressive talent for inventing terrible things while trying to solve good problems. She studied him again. You are more thoughtful than you pretend. Zane smiled faintly. Please do not spread that rumor. The upload bar climbed to 6%. A small alert flashed suddenly across the screen. Zane's fingers immediately moved back to the keyboard. What is wrong? Kessa asked. Nothing yet, he said. He opened another network window. Several red icons blinked across the routing map. They are scanning network traffic. Kessa stood again. Can they detect the data fragments? Not directly, Zane said, but they might notice unusual packet volume. He typed several commands rapidly. Additional routing paths open. What are you doing now? Adding noise. More connections appeared. Soon hundreds of new data streams flowed across the display. What kind of noise? She asked. Music streaming, game updates, cloud backups. He paused briefly. And a very large number of cat videos. Kessa sighed. You truly believe these animals will save us? Statistically speaking, Zane said, Cat videos account for nearly 15% of civilian network traffic. She blinked. That is an alarming statistic. It is also extremely useful. The alert icon slowly faded as the military scans struggled to separate real traffic from the sudden flood of harmless data. Zane leaned back again. See, he said, dolphins and cats. Dolphins? Oh, right, Zane said. I also started a documentary download. Kessa rubbed her forehead slightly. I cannot decide if you are a genius or completely insane. Those two conditions overlap frequently. The upload bar reached 10%. Kessa watched the numbers carefully. If the evidence is released, she said quietly, many powerful people will lose their positions. Good. Some may attempt retaliation. Zane shrugged. Also good. She looked at him again. You truly do not fear consequences. Zane thought about that for a moment. Then he pointed toward the screen. I fear unfinished uploads more. Kessa followed his gesture. The data continued moving through the network, fragment by fragment, scattering across thousands of hidden paths. For the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders relaxed slightly. Zane noticed. You know, he said casually, when this is over, you might consider choosing safer houses to knock on. Kessa looked at him. Why? Because this one, he said, gesturing toward the glowing machines, has a terrible habit of starting revolutions. The upload reached 93% just before sunrise. The city outside had grown strangely quiet during the long night. The armored vehicles that once filled the street had slowly disappeared hours earlier, leaving only the faint hum of distant traffic and the pale glow of morning light creeping between the buildings. Inside the apartment, however, the machines were still wide awake. Every processor hummed like an overworked bee. The monitors painted the room in shifting blues and greens, while streams of encrypted fragments continued racing across the network. Zane had not slept. Kessa had not either. She stood near the window now, watching the first line of sunlight rise over the horizon. Her long ears caught the light, the soft curve of them glowing faintly gold. Behind her, Zane sat in his chair, staring at the final progress bar. 94%, he muttered. Kessa glanced back. You have been saying numbers all night. Numbers are comforting, Zane replied. They behave logically. She looked at him with quiet curiosity. You risked everything tonight for logic? Zane rubbed his eyes. No, he admitted. Probably not. The upload bar crept forward again. 95%. Kessa returned her attention to the window. My people believed science should protect life, she said softly. When I discovered what they had done to the project, I thought I would be alone. Zane leaned back slowly. You were almost right. She turned slightly. But you were not alone, he shrugged. You knocked on my door. That was not a plan. Well, Zane said, it turned out to be a surprisingly effective one. The progress bar climbed again, 96%. Kessa walked closer to the workstation. The screens reflected in her eyes as she studied the code flowing across them. You understand that once this finishes, she said quietly, the evidence will spread everywhere. Yep. News networks, governments, investigators. Also, yep. She folded her arms. And the people responsible will not be pleased. Zane nodded. I imagine several careers will end very dramatically. And possibly several lives. Zane paused. Then he gave a small shrug. People who plan genocide usually lose sympathy points with me. Kessa studied him carefully. You speak as if this decision was easy. It wasn't, Zane said. He gestured toward the window. Yesterday, my biggest problem was a missing semicolon in my code. And today, he said, I helped expose a military conspiracy while hiding an alien scientist in my closet. Kessa tilted her head slightly. You forgot the vacuum robot. Zane smiled faintly. Right, heroic vacuum robot. The upload reached 98%. Kessa exhaled slowly. Almost. Zane's fingers hovered above the keyboard. Once the fragments finished transferring, he said, I released the decryption key. And then? Then the entire internet opens the files at the same time. She watched him. That will be chaos. Correct. 99%. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sun cleared the horizon fully now, flooding the city with soft morning light. The final fragment transmitted. 100%. The progress bar turned green. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Zane pressed one final key. The encryption key launched into the global network. It propagated instantly. Millions of systems began reconstructing the data fragments scattered across the planet. Kessa stared at the screen. It is done. Zane leaned back slowly. Well, he said, that was exciting. Within seconds, the first alerts began appearing. News networks, independent researchers, data analysts. The files were spreading faster than anyone could stop them. Kessa watched the flood of global reactions appear across the screen. Shock, outrage, investigations announced, emergency political statements. The truth was moving now, unstoppable. She closed her eyes briefly. When I left the research facility, she said quietly, I believed I might die before anyone learned the truth. Zane nodded. That does sound like a very stressful week. She looked at him again. You changed that. Zane waved a hand dismissively. I mostly provided internet access. Kessa's expression softened. You did more than that. For a moment, the apartment fell quiet except for the hum of machines cooling down. Zane finally stood and stretched. Well, he said, good news. What good news? The soldiers are definitely not coming back now. Kessa glanced toward the window. The street below was empty. The military vehicles were gone. In their place, ordinary city traffic had returned. Life was continuing. She turned back to him. What will you do now? Zane thought about that for a moment. First, he said, I'm going to sleep for approximately 12 hours. She laughed softly. And after that? He looked around the apartment. The cables, the machines, the glowing screens that had helped change the course of events across several worlds. I suppose, he said slowly, my life will be slightly less boring. Kessa stepped closer. When I knocked on your door, she said, I asked you to hide me. Zane nodded. Yes, but what I truly needed, she continued, was someone willing to believe that truth is worth protecting. Zane smiled faintly. Careful, he said. You're making me sound heroic. You were. He shook his head. I was curious. Kessa studied him for a moment. Curiosity, she said, may be the most powerful force in the universe. Zane considered that. Either that, he said, or cat videos. She laughed again, and for the first time since the night had begun, the apartment no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like the beginning of something new.